I'm Sahar Zand, the host of Dirty Work, a podcast series for Sky News about the world's largest police organisation, Interpol. Interpol's Red Notices are essentially a digital wanted person poster meant to help the police forces around the world to catch some of the world's most dangerous fugitive criminals. But our investigation has revealed how Red Notices are also vulnerable to abuse by those in power, like authoritarian regimes, to make life hell for the people they don't like. In our second episode, I take you to Interpol's headquarters in Lyon to meet the man in charge, the General Secretary of Interpol, Jürgen Stuck. He's adamant that Interpol is working as it should and that he has fixed the problems. But I encourage you to hear the stories of the people we've spoken to who found themselves on the wrong end of an Interpol Red Notice to see for yourself if you agree with Jürgen Stuck. You can now subscribe to Dirty Work wherever you get your podcasts from.
Even before war broke out in Ukraine, people from outside the country joined its army to defend it against Russia, including British man Aiden Aslin, who joined the Ukrainian Marines in 2018. He was living in Mykolaiv with his fiancée and felt compelled to defend his adopted homeland from the growing threat of Russian invasion following their illegal seizure of Crimea just a few years earlier.
I looked at going to Ukraine to start a new life for myself.
Then, in February 2022, as Russia mounted that full-scale offensive, Aiden and his unit were called up to the frontline in Mariupol. Aiden found himself at the heart of the city's resistance to the encircling Russians in the infamous Azovstal steelworks. His unit eventually ran out of supplies and surrendered to pro-Russian forces.
If you're watching this, it means that we've surrendered. We lasted about a month, ran out of ammunition, food. The only thing we had left was water.
Singled out for his British passport, Aiden was brutally interrogated, turned into a propaganda tool, tried by a kangaroo court, and then sentenced to death. But after 6 months, Aiden made it out alive. I'm Niall Paterson, and on this episode of the Sky News Daily, I'll be speaking to Aiden about fighting the Russians, his time in captivity, and his eventual release. Just a warning, we will be including graphic descriptions of violence. Aiden, good to have you on the Daily. Just tell me about the situation in and around where you were. I mean, it gradually worsened. We all saw the pictures at the time. I mean, you were lucky enough, though, to have seen what the place looked like before the Russians came. I'm not. All I know of Mariupol is destruction and rubble and death.
Mariupol as a city was it was a pretty Soviet-esque city. However, in recent years, Ukraine had done a lot to bring it up to the standards of other cities. There was a lot of potential was being put into it, and so much investment going on to just make it a city that's people want to come to. And I'd been to it a few times. We were about 145 kilometers away from Ukrainian lines, so we knew we were cut off. There's probably a slim chance that we're going to get out of this. We were preparing the vehicles that we had in our units, and that the other units, being in a steelworks, there's a lot of steel and a lot of equipment laying around. So we quickly got to work, preparing the trucks and stuff, welding steel onto the side of them, because we basically were planning to try and break out and drive to friendly lines. And we also knew that the chance that we are successful isn't looking too good, but we still prepared for it. And in the first week of April, that's when we ran out of food. So we had all the vehicles ready, units came from the positions and everyone was ready to go. It was probably 2 o'clock in the morning. And just at the last minute, it was cancelled for some reason, I don't know why. So we returned to our positions, and it wasn't until the day later, I believe it was, that the aviation located the trucks where we had loaded the ammunition into, and in the trucks was the entire battalion ammunition. So once that was hit, that was the moment that we realized it's going to be all over. We have no ammunition, we have no food. What can we do? We've got heavily injured soldiers and civilians that need medical attention. There's not much else we are able to do anymore.
When you say requiring medical attention, I mean, what were the injuries that your comrades were suffering?
We had all sorts of injuries. We had people that had lost limbs, had concussion, that needed like urgent medical attention. I think in my bunker alone there was probably about maybe 300 like injured that were brought in after other positions fell to the enemy. And then there was, of course, the evacuation of the local hospital where they split the injured up into different areas to be attended to.
So when you are presented with this list of options, and you are someone who had been serving with the Marines for 4 years, you'd served previously, of course in Syria. What is the thought process at a time like that?
It's hard to put into perspective.
You don't want to surrender, certainly not to the Russians.
Yeah, of course. You know, like being in Syria, surrender was never an option because you know 100% what's going to happen to you if you surrender. But in Mariupol, I remember thinking to myself, like, okay, I can't go out in the trucks because that's pretty much suicide. That's not going to be successful. And then there was the option of like trying to escape on foot. And I remember asking my commander, I said to him, like, I was thinking that might be a good option, but then I asked him how many of us were trying to get out, and at that time, like he said, pretty much everyone. And I was like, okay, that's going to end in disaster.
I mean, you're a military man, so I mean, you have presumably at points, thought about your own mortality and that this might be it, and this is the end. When you were in that factory in Mariupol, what was the predominant thought in your head? This is it, or did you think that there was still a chance to live?
At this point, for myself, I knew as a foreigner, I had already accepted that I probably have 90% chance of being just killed. I accepted that. So
tell me about that moment when surrender took place, when you are you are taken into captivity and then taken away from comrades.
They loaded us onto a bus and we were driven to a town called Sartanar, which is a village just in between Pavlopol and Mariupol. I'd been there quite a few times because it was our village we went to get supplies and stuff. So we were driven there. As soon as we got off the bus, that's when the intimidation and violence started. We were put into a warehouse and they put us into stress positions straight away.
Stress positions are?
So we were stood up with our head like against the wall, and we had to keep ourselves off balance with our arms behind our back. I think in total we stayed like that for 11 hours with moments in between where you'd get called out and you would have to like give your documents, and they would ask you who you are. When it came to me, they did the same thing. They asked, like, I gave them my military ID, and then I gave them my veterans card, and then I gave them my passport. But my passport, it has a Ukrainian cover on it, so if you look at it, like, you wouldn't think it's a British passport. And I remember when he opened it, I was like, this is going to be interesting. He opened it, and he was like, moronically, like, just looking at it and then looking back at me, and he immediately like asked me in Russian, like, where am I from? So I replied to him in Russian, like, Great Britain. As soon as I said Great Britain, he, like, punched me on the nose and, like, beat me a few times. And then some of his senior told him to stop. At that moment, like, I kind of took it under the chin like I expected it, like it's frontline, there's adrenaline. Like, so a day later, the intelligence guys came and they picked me out of the warehouse, which by at this point had, like, 700 Ukrainian, like, soldiers in it. And they basically asked me just like very basic questions, like what unit am I in, like who am I? And then they put me back in the warehouse, and a short moment later, they called my name again. I went to the front door and they put handcuffs on me, and then they led me back to the SUV, which had like Donetsk People's Republic license plate on it. And I got into the back of the boot, and I remember when I got in the back, I remember telling myself like this next stage isn't going to be nice. I was expecting, like, this is the part where it gets nasty.
Why was that expectation there? Because of the violence that you'd already seen, or because of the fact that you had been singled out?
I knew it was coming just because I'd been singled out, and like I said, like that small beating I had, like when I showed him my passport, like I understood that's just the way it is. I get into the back of the car, and as we're driving out, I remember I think it was the passenger, he turned to me and said, like, now we're going to be taking you to be shot. And I remember the moment he said that, like, I didn't think about anything. I was just thinking about, okay, like, this is how I, like, go out. And I didn't respond to him. I just pretended that I didn't understood what he said. And I was just thinking about my family and just whatever thoughts I wanted to think about before I did get taken out. And it wasn't until like an hour into the journey that I realised to myself, like, obviously I'm not being shot, because you don't drive people for an hour to be shot. We drove for about 2.5 hours. We ended up in Donetsk, which I worked out from the just the cobblestone and like the direction of the sun and stuff. And as soon as I got out of the car, they took the bag off, and then they took the handcuffs off. And respectfully, like at that moment in time, like I had my hands behind my back out of like just like fear and respect. And some guy in a blue uniform, he immediately said something to me in Russian, but I didn't understand anything he said, because I think his accent was too thick, or he was just drunk. And as soon as I said like back politely, like, can you please repeat that in Russian, that's when the beating started. So he beat me relentlessly, like with a police baton. I fell to the floor, and then he dragged me into this building and into this empty room. There was two people in this room with a bag on their head stood against the wall. As soon as I saw it was empty, I was like, okay, yeah, this is the part of the captivity I like read about or expected. And he continued to beat me for about 2.5 hours roughly. At one point, I was like knocked unconscious, and as soon as I like regained consciousness, like they just started beating me. As well as this, they were also asking me like just very basic questions related to like what my position is in the military and stuff. And like every answer I gave would be like returned with like another beating. They made me strip down to see what my tattoos were. So everything that they like asked for and everything I gave like would always be met with like a beating. And then there was at one point this guy who's like beating, like torturing me basically. He's having a quick cigarette break, catching his breath. I'm like completely shriveled up, like exhausted myself, and he's like smoking his cigarette, and he like gets down onto his, crouches down sort of, looking at me, and he says like, did you see what I did to you? I was like, no. And then he like pointed to my shoulder, and then that's like when I looked and realized that he stabbed me. Of course, I didn't feel the stabbing because of all the adrenaline that was coming from the beating. And then just after that, he said about, do you know who I am? And I was like, no. And that's when he said, I am your death. And he went on to say, like, do you want a beautiful death or do you want a quick death? And at that moment, like after I'd seen I'd been stabbed, like I was pretty 100% sure that I'm going to be killed, just because I wasn't expecting to be stabbed. I only expected to be beaten relentlessly and stuff. So when he asked me that, I remember I replied back to him, I want a quick death. And he says, no, you're going to have a beautiful death. And I just remember thinking like everything that was going through my head at that moment was that this is how I die.
How is it possible for someone, for a human being, to cope with that level of violence, with that level of torture?
Around that time, there was the humanitarian aid worker, Mariupol, who was also taken into captivity. He died in Russian captivity, and as soon as he died, something high up in the Russian chain of command like happened, and they basically said, take all the foreigners and put them into protective custody. At this time, I was in the Donetsk pre-trial detention center, and I'd spent all my time there in this like solitary confinement cell with other Ukrainians. We had a 2-man cell, but there was 5 of us, and I wouldn't be taken out. I'd stay there day after day. The only time I'd be taken out is for propaganda. And after this event happened, I was taken away from the Ukrainians I was with, and I was put into an empty cell, like in the same cell block. And a few moments later, my Croatian friend from the battalion, he joined me. And we had no idea like why we were there. Like we couldn't process any of it.
You did have a trial of sorts.
Yeah. One
in which you received, well, you were told that you were going to be receiving the death penalty. I've never sat across the desk from someone who has been in that position before. What was that like?
It's hard to put into words because like nothing can like prepare you for like that eventual outcome of like standing in a courtroom, like I should say standing in a kangaroo court where everything is already designed to be against you. I remember there was the first 2 accusations that we were charged with, which was attempting to seize the constitution of the Donetsk People's Republic or overthrow, something like that. Second one was terrorist weapons training, just because we'd gone to boot camp in the Ukrainian military. And then the third one was mercenaryism. And when it came to it, we pleaded not guilty, but we pleaded guilty to the terrorism charge and the other charge because we knew if the mercenary charge gets dropped, this whole court case collapsed because we'll be POWs. So we pleaded not guilty to the mercenary charge. That's when I noticed my lawyer, who was, well, my fake lawyer, I call him. I noticed he was like trying to get my attention, like gesturing, like, why did you do that? And at that moment, I was like, I think we should speak to the lawyer. And he came over and he says, like, why did you say that? Like, you shouldn't have said that. And I was like, but we're not mercenaries. Like, under international law, we're protected. And that's the moment he turned to me and told me, like, there is no international law here.
After Aiden was sentenced to death back in June 2022, Denis Pushilin, the head of the pro-Russian Donetsk People's Republic, reaffirmed that Aiden should be shown no mercy. Brandon Lewis, the then Northern Ireland Secretary, told Sky News that the government was fully engaged with Ukrainian authorities in trying to help Aiden. Obviously, I wouldn't be talking to Aiden today had that death sentence been carried out. After the break, we'll discover how he became free. Clearly, that death sentence did not proceed as planned. In September 2022, after 6 months in captivity, Aiden was released as part of a prisoner exchange after an intervention by Saudi Arabia.
Hi, it's Kozak Gundy, Aiden Aslin and Sean Bennett. We just want to let everyone know that we're now out of the danger zone and we're on our way home to our families and whatnot. Not just us, there was also in total 10 foreigners that were in captivity.
We were released from being in Putin's custody, knowing that some of your comrades are still in captivity and knowing that the war continues in the way in which it does. Is there a part of you that wishes you were back there?
When I first got released, back in, I think it was in May time last year, I was in a cell with one of the battalion majors from my battalion, and we spent like a month together. And at the end of that month, they were transferred out of there. And I remember I got released. The moment I got back to Britain, as soon as I got like internet sorted again, I remember like getting my fiance to help me find him online. So I found his wife, and I was like so ecstatic that I like found her, and I messaged her and like told her who I am. And then she like replied back that he's still in captivity. And I remember when she told me that, it broke me like pretty mentally. I was pretty depressed when I heard that. However, luckily a month later he was exchanged. I remember I was on the train in London and I just saw a post on Facebook that there was another prison exchange, and I looked on the photo and I saw his photo. And I was like so happy that I saw it, and immediately like contacted his wife. And since then, like we speak like regularly. And I met up with him back when I went to Ukraine in May this year, and that was quite an emotional time for me, especially meeting him and then my battalion commander, who I was also in captivity with.
Do you think that the conflict in Ukraine is going to have a happy ending? Will Ukraine emerge from this victorious?
I certainly hope so, and I think the important thing is that the West continues to give us the weapons and the equipment that Ukraine needs to defend itself. When this war does come to an end, which it will, there is going to be a need for a similar thing to what happened with the end of the conflict in the Balkans. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a international tribunal that's needed so that people that are responsible for the atrocities that have been committed face justice, and I think that's going to need a huge international effort. And as long as the West keeps giving them what they need, especially air defense and everything else, I think we will have some sort of success in ending this war.
My thanks to Aiden for his impressive candour in recounting his experiences. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you next time.